Hi, thank you
Hi.
so much. I thought that was very, very practical for teaching students. I work with second graders, so I don't have to go that in depth,
No.
but I also work with adults in Spanish GED,
Hmm.
and that's why I'm taking this class to try to understand this because my background is in literature, not in history.
Ah,
And I've never really understood very well what you were talking about, the part about um that the government what hasn't been the rights that have not been specified shall be left to the state or to the people, that
hmm
amendment.
hmm
Was it like they were trying to think of, wow, is there something we are not thinking of, but we want to keep that right? And
That's
it's,
precisely correct.
can you give an example like in present
Yes. Yeah.
day?
Okay, so here's an example. Do you have a right to privacy?
Yes.
How do you know that? It's not in the Bill of Rights.
I thought it was.
Haha. So you see, that's your point. And so that's how they felt back then. If you list 27 rights, are those the only ones you have? And suppose you leave off privacy from that list. Does that mean it no longer exists?
Okay,
Do you have
got you.
yeah, so that's the point. And they took
Nice.
that very seriously back then.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Feel free to put them in the chat or to electronically raise your hand.
So we have a question in the chat box there, but does it mean that state governments can take that away? Well, now that gets you into one other thing they want you to talk about, and that's the Federalist, the powers of federalism, the balance between state power and federal power. And that's been a real back and forth over our history. There have been times when the federal government did very little and left most areas of governance to the states. There have been other times, like the New Deal, or the Great Society, where the federal government has greatly expanded its authority and its responsibilities. But then there's been reactions to that, like the Nixon presidency or the Reagan presidency, where people said, no, we've got to give more to the states, block grants. And, today it's kind of a hot topic. And so, can state governments take away powers that haven't been explicitly protected in the Bill of Rights? I think as a voter, you're going to be wrestling with that. And I know the Supreme Court has some cases currently that probably come close to that issue. So Joe, wouldn't you agree that that's a really vital issue for today?
It is a vital issue for today. Think privacy, in particular, think the right to gay marriage, more generally, think about abortion. And this is, Charlie talked about the 9th and 10th Amendments as essentially limits on government, right? This is one of those areas where those two amendments sort of foster an enormous amount of controversy, because the claim would be states have the authority to regulate things that they're not prohibited from regulating. That's the 10th Amendment claim. The 9th Amendment claim is there are rights out there that are beyond the scope of power of government. This is probably, you won't be doing this in second grade, but this is probably the kind of thing that you can pursue in a government class, or in, maybe you can fool around with it a bit in both sections of American history, from the time of the founding, talking about the tension between elements of the Constitution, and also the present day, using the examples that Charlie and I just sort of noted. And there are others.
Yeah, one of the ways that I've done this with kids, the hard part is it's a very abstract conversation. So how do you make it concrete? That list that where the kids list what's in the Bill of Rights, you could follow that up with by having them list what are the things that are not in the Bill of Rights but should be. And when you've done that, inevitably they're going to list things such as the ones that Joe just mentioned. And that's going to tip them off to what are some of the issues of today that bear on this issue. And that makes it more real, because then they become seekers of answers rather than listeners. And so they can start looking at the news and seeing, okay, can I find anything about privacy? Is anybody really wrestling with that issue today? and that they're coming back to class with things that are meaningful that they selected.
And it goes back to one of the things that Denver mentioned last week. And so, because somebody asked, why didn't they just put a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution when they sent it out to the states? And the reason was, at least Hamilton, in defending the Constitution in Federalist 84, said you don't need a Bill of Rights, because if you list them, people are going to think those are the only rights that you have, right? And that's the Ninth Amendment, and what Charlie was talking about there. Other questions? Raise your hand, just start speaking, or put it in the chat box.
Penny,
Christine? Sounded like you started to ask a question and then just got snipped off.
Well, we could talk about the document so that we have time to look at that for a few minutes, because I think we finished at 6:15. Is that correct? I mean, 5:15 your time.
6:15 our time. So, yeah, we can do that. And let me just say, before Charlie digs into the documents, the marked up First Amendment, what is now the First Amendment, the marked up Third Amendment, when Congress was fooling around with these things, is exceptionally useful in class. I mean, to show them the process and the nature of the deliberation and the textual responses they had to the ideas that are contained in those amendments really does captivate the kids, because it shows them this just didn't fall from the armpits of the gods, right? I mean, this was crafted and created by human beings.
So I'm going to share with you, I think, one of the best documents we have at the Center for Legislative Archives. And that one is something that's in the handout, and you probably have had a chance to look at it, but we're going to look at it together. You should be seeing on your screen right now a heavily marked up document, which is what the Senate did when they received the proposed amendments from the House. And you can see, if we look at the top of it together, you all see it, right? Yes. Yeah. Okay. You can see that Monday, the 24th of August, 1789. So this is about 2 months, 2.5 months after James Madison first proposed amendments. And you can see that they've been passed through a committee of the House, and then the whole House has debated them, amended them, and passed 17 of them to send to the Senate. And this is where you can take your kids into the sausage making machine that produced the Bill of Rights. And so, you know, you go in here and you see all kinds of, I mean, gosh, we could spend an hour just looking at this document, and we won't. We'll just look at some kind of highlights. But what was the First Amendment? Well, people will tell you that what we call the First Amendment was first because that was the most important. But on the screen right now, you can see actually it was the third and the fourth. And there's that heavily marked up version we looked at in the timeline down at the bottom of your screen. But up top, you see Article the First is about representation. And it's a long kind of Algebra 2-like problem. And what it says at the very end of it is that there should be a member of Congress for every 50,000 persons. And that sounds so absurd in a country of 300 million, because the kids will tell you if they had that many, and you can make them do the math, there'd be 6,000 members of the House potentially. And then they'll say to you, but they'd never get anything done. And you sound like an old comedian, you know, and you just need a drum to hit or something. But they do get stuff done with 435 people, which begs the questions of how do they do it? Well, the whole point of bringing this one into the class, it didn't get ratified by the states. But what is representation? And how many constituents should a member of Congress have? And how many does yours have? And who is that person? And get them to think about, if you were one of 50,000, would you be represented differently than as one of, I think it's 650,000? How is that different? And so, you know, it's getting kids to think about, what did the founders or the authors of the Bill of Rights have in mind when they were talking about the relationship of government to the citizen? And so, you know, when you bring these in, there's, even though they weren't ratified, there's all kinds of great stuff you can talk about. Article the second is kind of cool because that becomes the 27th Amendment. So you can tell them about, you know, how that one came back to life 200 years later after it was proposed. And I don't have time for it, but it's a sort of a Texas story about a kid who was a student at the University of Texas. You can look it up. But basically, the idea there is about, can people use government office to get rich? Can you elect a Congress that then just keeps raising its own salary? And this one says no. You need to have a subsequent election before they can change their pay. Then you see the Third and the Fourth Amendments. They were combined, and they became the first when the two preceding ones were not ratified by the state. So that's how the First Amendment got first. But I want us to look at Article the Fifth. Remember a minute ago, we were looking at that proposal about a well-regulated militia. Notice how that language came through the House of Representatives. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people being the best security of a free state. That's identical to what we just read. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no one religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. So they have a conscientious objector right that's protected in this version of what becomes the Second Amendment. And if you go in the app, you can see how it was changed and how it became the language that we're familiar with. But if you want to get the kids to wrestle with it, what's the Second Amendment do? Well, I know from the bumper sticker on the back of my truck that it protects my right to own a gun. Does it? Maybe it does. I'm not saying it doesn't. Maybe it does. But maybe there's a debate that could be had about, were they talking about guns when they wrote this? Or were they talking about the militia versus a standing army? And that kind of a debate is what gets kids to read a text closely. Now, the second graders, I don't think they're going to go there, but I hope in your government class you can get kids to wrestle with it on that level, you know? So that's one of those where you want to be very careful how you hold that debate, because you're the one who will be fielding the outraged phone calls from parents, because people do get a little heated about the whole gun rights thing in our day and age. But it's really important to think about how in the Revolutionary era, the standing army of the British Empire became this oppressive force. And people were very leery of starting a strong central government and giving that central government an army, because couldn't Congress act the way Parliament had acted and use their central standing army to oppress the people? And so perhaps some of the anti-federalist sentiment was not about guns. It was about armies and how professional armies can become a tool of oppression. So, you know, it gets kids to think about history. See, you got to tell the kids, I believe you got to tell them that the past is a foreign country, and we can't take our values and assumptions to that foreign country. We have to try to see that age through the eyes of the people who lived in it. And trying to come to terms with a statement like this is one of the ways that you can get kids to think about how the past was different from today. Well, you'll notice the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th, and the 9th. All these are mostly adopted into various aspects of the Bill of Rights. A couple of them are combined and reshuffled in different ways, but they're basically criminal rights. And there's one about the jury trial in civil cases, but they're mostly the protections, due process of law protections that people have in criminal cases. Where you can start getting interested in talking about this document with the kids, I mean, those you just kind of go, oh yeah, so that's where that came from. That's kind of interesting. A provocative one that's not is the 14th, because that was stricken down. James Madison said this was the most important idea in the whole project. Now let's look at it together. Article the 14th. No state shall infringe the right of trial by jury in criminal cases, nor the right of conscience, nor the freedom of speech or of the press. Now just ponder that for a moment. It sounds a lot like the First Amendment is being repeated. But the critical words are the first two. No state. And this reflects the fear that Madison had. He felt that what was going to really screw up this project of a republic was the idea of runaway democracy in the states, that the states are going to do things like create paper money. The states are going to do things like impair the collection of debts, and they're going to take property away from the rich and give it to the poor, and they're going to do all kinds of crazy things. And that's going to really be problematic. How do you rein in the wrong-headed democracy of various states? And so Madison's idea was that the federal Congress would have a veto power. And so you can see from the language of this proposed article, no state shall infringe the right of trial by jury. So if a state does, the federal government could step in. If a state gets in the way of the rights of conscience, which I think is one of those age-appropriate things to get teenagers to wrestle with, but we'll come back to that. Again, the federal government could step in, and then the other freedom of speech or the press. So it's kind of interesting to ask why Madison, who then wrote the Virginia Resolution 10 years later, why Madison would feel that this was the most important idea. Did Madison change, or did the times change? Some historians, they get into a debate, were there two James Madisons or one James Madison? But I don't know. I mean, the cool thing about it is to get the kids to look at this. Now, all right, so I showed you the 14th Amendment a minute ago, and I said you have to understand the Bill of Rights within the context of the 14th Amendment. Take a look at this language in Article 14. Is anybody picking up the suggestion I'm making? Does this or does this not sound a lot like Section 1 of the 14th Amendment? And I had the language of that on a slide for a nanosecond, so I know you've memorized it for life, but basically, all persons born in or naturalized or citizens of the United States, no state shall deny to citizens or to any people due process of law and equal protection of the law. And so, you've got here something that anticipates the 14th Amendment, because as the 14th Amendment creates the federal authority to enforce civil rights, so this 14th article would have empowered the federal government to rein in the states. So you're getting people to think about, federalism, and you're getting them to think about civil rights and all kinds of good things by bringing this one into your classroom. So I hope that, you'll find a way to work that into your class. We've been talking about the 10th Amendment, which is Article 17 here. And we're going to look at this one, and then we're going to go uphill for a moment and look at the preceding one. But let's look at this one, because we had a question about it. I want you to look at how the text is changed, because when you're looking at a primary source like this Senate markup, you have the opportunity to ask how the text evolved during the debate. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's what we know as the 10th Amendment. Okay, let's take out some of the language, because we can see that to the United States was added later. And you can see that or to the people was added later. So let's read it without that language, okay? The powers not delegated by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. Take the moment, look at the chat box, and put in there some thoughts about, so what does that mean? How's that different from the 10th Amendment? If you take out the added in cursive language, you've got powers not delegated by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. What would that say about undelegated powers? I'm sure Joe talked to you about the necessary and proper clause and the context, the important historical context of that with Pizza Hut in Wisconsin. But in this case, the necessary and proper clause Joe would not have gotten the family car to go to Pizza Hut if this amendment had been ratified as it was first written. And so it's revised to be more of a balance between state and federal powers. Diana says, yeah. And I think that's kind of interesting, and get the kids to think about, well, who are the people that they're talking about down there? It doesn't say the people of the states. What people? And get them to read, what's in front of them. Now, in the last couple minutes we have left, let's look at number 16. You know the old saying?
Charles,
Yep.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
That always bothers me.
Okay.
What people, because my understanding was it only white men who had property or had money, or it didn't include women, it didn't include Native Americans, it didn't include slaves. So yeah, what people had rights?
I agree with you. And I agree with what you're saying. And so, that's why the 14th Amendment is so incredibly important. And that makes the story of American history that you're teaching so important, because are we moving from a time period where we, the people, meant 1% of living human beings to a more inclusive age over time? And is that a one-way trip, or are there times where we go backwards? And so you can think, about it with the kids that way, because in the future, their choices as voters are going to heavily influence the future of that balance. So I thank you for your question. Never say never is the old saying. And in just 2 minutes, we can look at Article 16. The powers delegated by the Constitution to the government of the United States shall be exercised as therein appropriated, so that the legislative shall never exercise the powers vested in the executive or judicial, nor the executive powers vested in the legislature or judicial, nor the judicial the powers vested in the legislature or the executive. You want to have fun? You get your kids to ask, suppose this one had been ratified. How would American history have been different? You can see that they wanted everybody to stay in their own lane. But the story of our history has been that the branches don't stay in their own lanes. Judges make laws. Presidents and create federal agencies that issue policies that have the effect of law. So in effect, they're acting like a legislature. There's all kinds of stuff going on. The size of the branches relative to one another changes over time. And I think it's important to ask them about this, because the fundamental question you can get at is about the nature of a constitution. Is it a scripture that we adhere to religiously, to the original meaning of it and the original language of it? Or is it a set of understandings that we work with and change through the decisions we make and the policies we adopt over time? You get your choice on that one. I will not express an opinion. But, if you have the kids wrestle with that question of what is a constitution, you're preparing them to be more informed observers of the politics happening around them. So regrettably and apologetically, we have only that much time to share. And I want to thank you for looking at this document with me. And I hope you find a place for this in your classroom. And I hope the tools that I've shown you tonight give you the means to get your kids engaged in it. So I'll stop sharing, Joe, and hand it back to you.
Charlie, thanks so much. And teachers, now you know exactly what I meant at the very beginning of this. Charlie knows stuff about what you do and how you do it, and explains it incredibly beautifully, and just is a wonderful final speaker in this series.